The previous lecture segment discussed explanations at the level of the social environment. How do social factors like authority figures and peers influence what people do? Now I'm going to switch to explanations at the level of internal mental processes, discussing how cognitive factors impact thoughts and behaviors in social contexts. When social psychologists focus on the role of internal mental processes, this is often in the context of the attitudes that people have. An attitude is a positive or negative opinion or belief about something. Some attitudes are relatively mundane. For example, I have a very positive attitude toward Trek bikes. Not exactly an earth-shattering attitude, but I'm an avid cyclist and I've certainly spent a fair amount of money at the local Trek dealer. I also have attitudes about things that are more important, such as the value of hybrid courses. I think hybrid courses can, if implemented properly, really enhance a student's learning. And this has led me to spend hours and hours developing hybrid courses that thousands of students have experienced. I also have attitudes about things like racism, the environment, and religion. These are even more profound issues. Attitudes vary in their strength and their specificity. I have a weak negative attitude toward Birkenstock sandals. This attitude is not very strong. I don't think there's anything wrong with people who like Birkenstocks, and I actually once owned a great pair of Birkenstock loafers. I just don't care for their sandals, so that's a weak attitude. Not surprisingly, research by social psychologists has confirmed that strong attitudes are much more predictive of how someone actually behaves than weak attitudes. The fact that I even tried on a pair of Birkenstock loafers means that my weak attitude against Birkenstocks didn't have much impact on my behavior. On the other hand, my strong positive attitude about Trek bikes has led me to spend thousands of dollars on them. What isn't quite as obvious is that the specificity of an attitude also has a big impact on whether it predicts behavior. I have a pretty strong positive attitude toward eating healthy foods, but that's a pretty broad attitude. If you looked at vegetable consumption among people with this broad attitude, it might be a little higher than average. However, if someone has the more specific attitude that eating meat is unhealthy, this will lead to a bigger impact on behavior, such as becoming a vegetarian. So, specific attitudes have a stronger impact on behavior than general attitudes. Another factor that impacts whether attitudes impact behavior is how accessible the attitude is. For example, I think about the environment a lot, and my attitudes about environment-related issues are easily accessible. It doesn't take much time for me to tell you that people should ride bikes instead of driving, or that solar panels are both good for the environment and very sensible from a financial perspective, at least in sunny places like Davis. These attitudes are on my mind every time I get on my bike and every time I see some solar panels, so they're highly accessible. On the other hand, if you ask me what I think about poverty in underdeveloped countries, I also have some strong attitudes, but they're just not on my mind very much. It takes some mental effort for me to dredge up my opinions and the things I know about this topic. I feel pretty strongly about it, but it's not something that I'm reminded of several times a day, like I am every time I get on my bike. And because my attitudes about the environment are more accessible than my attitudes about poverty in underdeveloped countries, my environmental attitudes have a bigger impact on my daily behavior. That's just an anecdote, but it's backed up by many studies. For example, correlational studies show that people who can more rapidly generate their opinion about a presidential candidate are more likely to vote for that candidate than people who are slower to tell you their opinion. In other words, if two people have the same opinion about a presidential candidate, but the opinion is more available in one person than in the other, the opinion will be more likely to lead to an actual vote in the person whose opinion is more available. However, that's just a correlation. Maybe some other factor explains the difference. For example, maybe the opinions are actually stronger in the people who can generate them more rapidly. However, other studies have experimentally manipulated the availability of an attitude. For example, Russell Fazio and his colleagues have done studies where they have people repeatedly express an opinion, making it more available. And this leads to an increase in the probability that the people will actually behave in a manner consistent with their opinion.